All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to part two of our new series, putting ecology into ecological economics. Once again, our speaker this week is Olivia Pereira from the Levin Lab as a postdoctoral scholar with the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD. And this week's talk is linked to last week's understanding and valuing human connections to deep sea methane seeps off Costa Rica. And without that, I will turn it over to you, Olivia. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Sharing my screen. Oh, are you seeing it full screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Let me hide voting meeting controls. Okay, cool. So thanks for coming again this week. I think that this week is right up your alley. You're probably going to understand a lot more of what I'm saying. And I think that last week I showed you why scientists and why we deep sea people care about methane seeps. And I'm hoping that today I can show you why people care or should care at least about methane seeps and the deep sea in general. So this was a research and interdisciplinary project that I had, and it is published. Oh, oh, go back. It is published in Ecological Economics, so you can find it, it's open access, you can find it online. And I really just wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Mark, Richard, and Jorge. Mark and Richard were the economists that helped me throughout this entire project, um, from the design of the experiment to the data analysis. I had to learn a lot about economics to be able to do this project, um, but if it wasn't for them, I know that I wouldn't be able to make it. And Jorge is our collaborator from Costa Rica. I will talk about this later, but the survey was all done in Spanish. And if it wasn't for the collaborators also, it wouldn't have worked out so well. So just a recap from last week, methane seeps are these deep sea ecosystems that we find worldwide, on continental margins associated with high tectonic activity. They are ecosystems that are fueled by chemosynthetic organic matter production. So that means that we have microbes taking up chemical compounds in the water to produce organic matter, fueling this ecosystem. The videos are not playing. Hopefully, they will start playing. Um, Methane seeds play a really important role in climate regulation and carbon sequestration because we have methane seeping out of the seafloor. And if it wasn't for the microbes and the animals using this methane, it would be released into the water column and to the atmosphere. So methane seeps can be both a source and sink of methane. And methane seeds provide a lot of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are benefits to society provided by the ecosystem. So carbon sequestration, like I mentioned, oil and gas, nutrient cycling, endemic species, so species that are only found at methane seeps, nursery and feeding habitats for economically important fisheries, and cultural services like education, outreach, inspiration for art and movies, and also the spiritual connection that some people have to the deep ocean. And because they provide all of these services, there are disturbances and threats to methane seeps. So I mentioned that they serve as feeding and nursery grounds for economically important fisheries. So bottom trawling is a big thing for methane seeps, oil and gas extraction for the energy industry, and obviously climate change with ocean warming and ocean deoxygenation. But also, I just want to remind you that of the importance of methane seeps for the climate regulation. So that they can both be a positive or a negative feedback into that the climate change and what's happening in the ocean in terms of warming and acidification. So we know that there's this increasing interest in deep sea resources. You might have heard about not only deep sea mining, but deep sea fishing and other resources that we're trying to extract from the deep ocean. But there is this gap in understanding the ecosystem services that are associated with those resources. We have some idea of the services that these ecosystems provide, but it's hard to link the service to a resource. And it's really hard for us to value the things that we don't know, but it's important that we do so so we can value what could be lost if we do decide to extract those resources. So the goal of this research was to examine people's perceptions about the deep sea, to evaluate what people value about the deep sea, and how much people are willing to pay for sea protection in Costa Rica. And like I showed you last week, Costa Rica is this incredible place for us to study methane seeps and environmental gradients, but it's also a really great country for us to do marine conservation work. And that is because Costa Ricans really value the biodiversity. They are very committed to marine conservation. So they actually, with this increase in their marine protected area, they actually reached already the goal of protecting more than 30% of their territory by 2030. So it was super amazing and just an incredible opportunity and a privilege to be working in Costa Rica, but also in collaboration with Costa Ricans, because you can really see how much they care for their biodiversity. And I hope that you see that also by the end of this talk. So to do this research, we conducted a survey with a panel of 500 Costa Ricans, taxpayers older than 18, using the website or the platform Qualtrics. We had to get RAB approval for because this is a human subject research, and all the respondents were remunerated based on the agreement that they have with Qualtrics. The survey was conducted in Spanish and it consisted of some deep sea science questions that I will go over them with you. A video explaining with footage from methane seeps from Costa Rica, explaining what methane seeps are and the importance and the ecosystem services provided by seeps. The screen choice experiment that I'm going to show you what that looks like, and demographic questions so we could not only understand who are answering our survey and if our sample is representative of the Costa Rican population, but also so that we could see if the social demographic variables are influencing the responses to the other questions in the survey. So how can we value deep sea ecosystem services if we don't know much about them? Discrete choice experiments are very useful to value things that we don't know and non-use values. And I think probably all of you know what non-use values are, but just to give an example, non-use values are things like valuing biodiversity. So for example, I really like Yeti crabs. I think they are beautiful and just amazing animals. And I value them just from knowing that they exist. They're down there doing their own thing and being alive. So that's one example. And with discrete choice experiments, we can derive people willingness to pay for protection by associating attributes to an ecosystem and choice cards in a survey. So this is what, excuse me, our choice card looked like. We chose 3 different attributes of methane seeps. So we have presence of seep endemic species, and here we changed the word from endemic to unique. So it is easier for people to understand what we mean. Importance of the seep to commercial fisheries and potential for climate regulation. So you can see that these 3 attributes that we chose are ecosystem services and resources provided by the methane seeps. Each of these attributes has 3 levels. So presence of seep endemic species, the levels were the seep doesn't have any endemic species. The seep has endemic species that are found at seeps worldwide and at seeps only in Costa Rica, or the seep has endemic species from seeps worldwide. With the importance of the seep to commercial fisheries, the alternatives were the seep doesn't have any commercial fisheries. If it provides feeding grounds to commercial fisheries or provides reproduction sites for commercial fisheries. For potential for climate regulation, the levels were little potential, some potential, and great potential. So for the climate regulation potential, what we were thinking here is just how much of the methane the animals are trapping down there, are using and taking up, and not letting it go into the water column and to the atmosphere. So that's the idea. The cards then had three options. Option one is the status quo option, is the option where no conservation measures would be applied. Options two and three had at least an increase in one of these units, so in one of these levels of at least one of these attributes. We also had costs associated with each option. We show cards to people and we ask them, from these options, which one do you prefer? So they can always, excuse me, option one was always the same for every card. So they always had the option of choosing, they don't want to pay anything and they don't want to protect methane seeps that have these characteristics. If they chose option two and three, it means that they are willing to pay this amount of money to pay a methane seep that has these conditions here. We randomize these cards, we move these alternatives around by keeping option one, like I said, always the same at every card, and we ended up with 36 different choice cards. We showed 6 cards for each responded. So that means that we ended up with 6 versions of the survey. So each one with 6 different cards. And the versions of the survey were randomized to the respondents. And I want to say that this part of the research was in a huge consultation with the Costa Ricans, our friends and collaborators that not only helped with the survey and the translation of the survey and the cards to English, but also helped me think about the cost levels for the cards, considering their not only their coins, but also their average income and things like that. So it would make sense to ask people to pay this much money. So I just want to give a little example of how these cards work. Let's pretend that we have our sample. We show people this first card here. This is a simpler version where we have only 2 attributes and 2 options. And we get that 10 people chose to pay $10 to protect a methane seep with great potential for climate regulation. But 90 people did not want to protect this methane seep. So they chose this option one and no conservation measures would be applied. We then show the same people this different card where we now also are protecting unique species or endemic species for $200. And now we have 40 people choosing option two in this card and less people choosing option one. So looking at these 2 cards, we can think that perhaps people don't care as much for the potential for climate regulation and they're not willing to pay a lot of money to protect a methane seep that has this potential. But when endemic species are introduced and now we have a seep with not only the great potential, but also with endemic species, people are willing to pay a lot more to protect that methane seep. So this is the idea of the choice cards. With the choice cards, we can calculate willingness to pay for protection based on the attributes or for protection just in general. So the first thing that I asked in the survey was, what are your first thoughts when you hear the words deep sea? This was an open-ended question because I really just wanted to know what people think about it without any other information. So this was even before the footage of methane seeps. So we could really just get that first initial thought about the deep sea. I translated the answers and I categorized them into these categories that you're seeing here. So this is kind of like a word map. The shading of the gray shading represent the quantity. So how many times these things were mentioned. And you can see that people talked about the different animals that we find in the deep sea, the resources associated with it, the environment itself, so how deep it is, how cold and dark or far from reach. So really the physical characteristics of the environment. They talked about specific places in Costa Rica, like Isla del Coco, which was really cool to see. This is the place where the marine protected area just increased and is now protecting. But they also talked about emotions. So, as a deep sea scientist, it was really cool to see that people have emotions towards deep sea. So, some of them did mention the dangers and fear and monsters that they think that they find or they have towards the deep sea. But what was cool about that is that almost every time that someone mentioned danger and fear, it was followed by words like mysteries and unknown. So showing us that people are not necessarily afraid just because it's scary, but it's mostly because of the unknown, of not knowing exactly what's down there. But people also talked about how beautiful and paradise and peaceful the deep sea is. There was one person that even wrote a little poem about the deep sea. So it was really beautiful to see the responses and see how many people have this emotional connection to the deep sea. We then asked for the level of agreement on deep sea science questions. So this was just, we showed these statements here. Oops. We showed the statements here and we asked if they agreed or not with them. So statements like the deep sea is dark and cold. There's a lot of animal life in the deep sea. Deep sea animals depend on food that sinks from shallow waters. And we see that most people agreed with the provided statements about deep sea science. So these top ones here. But there were more neutrals towards statements about seeps and on the role of the deep sea in climate mitigation, especially these bottom three here, actually. So there are areas in the deep sea where methane is expelled from the seafloor. Deep sea microbes can use methane to grow. The deep sea has potential to regulate the climate. These statements are scientifically correct. So we use this level of agreement on deep sea science questions to try to understand how much people know about the deep sea. To do that, we created a point system. So considering that this statement is true, if people totally agree with it, we gave them 1 point. Agreed, 0.75, neutral, zero point 0.5, disagree, 0.25, and totally disagree, 0. We summed it up and we created what we call the knowledge index. So out of 10 points, how many points did they have to show us how much they know about the deep sea? We also asked them for their self-perception. So we straight up ask, how much do you think you know about the deep sea? And we see here, this is the results from both of these. So the self-perception knowledge on the left and the calculated knowledge based on that point system with the statements about deep sea science. And we can see that even though a lot of people or most people said that they have little or some knowledge here in blue and green, a lot of people did really well on the statements, showing us that they actually know quite a lot more than they think that they do. We then ask people to rank the importance of ecosystem services to them. So the way that we did that, we asked them, what are the most important connections that you have to the deep sea? And the options were habitat or biodiversity, provision of food, climate regulation, mineral resources, and biomedical potential. And we asked them to rank these services. More than 50% of the respondents ranked biodiversity as first or second most important connection to the deep sea. And more than 50% ranked mineral resources and biomedical potential as fourth and fifth. So showing us that people seem to feel more connected because of the biodiversity value, the non-use value of the deep sea ecosystems, rather than for the physical resources that we can extract from the deep sea, like minerals and biomedical potential. We then had the choice cards, so each person responding 6 different choice cards, and we analyzed the choice card data using Stata. And to use data, we ran some mixed logit models. I honestly, that was the part that I needed a lot of help from Mark and Richard because I was new to it. I even had to learn how to use data because I'm used to using different softwares. And with this mixed logit models, we can calculate the willingness to pay and if these different attributes are significant in the model. So we can see here with the willingness to pay. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that we ran the models without weighting the data and weighting the data. So what happened here was that our sample was not representative of the Costa Rican population. We use a Costa Rica census to compare the sample to the Costa Rican population. And we had a bias in gender, age, and education in our sample. So we ran these models to analyze the data without weighting, so without considering this bias in our sample, and weighting the data so that we would consider what a representative population would be willing to pay. So with the weighted values, we see that people are willing to pay more to protect seeps that have endemic species, followed by seeps that have potential for climate regulation, and then for seeps that have importance to commercial fisheries. So again, showing us that people care more and are willing to pay more for the biodiversity, for the animals that live down there, rather than for the different resources. We also saw that with any gain, so it doesn't really matter for the attribute or the level, people were still willing to pay quite a lot. This is also per year. So they were still willing to pay to protect methane seeps whenever there was a little bit of gain into those attributes and levels. We also included demographic variables into the mixed logic models to see how the social demographics are influencing willingness to pay. So you can see here in the table that not all of these were statistically significant except for the education group, so how educated people are. But we did see some interesting patterns. We saw a higher willingness to pay among women. This is actually often seen in economic valuation studies. Women tend to be willing to pay more. We saw a lower willingness to pay among workers in the marine sector. And these workers in the marine sector, they were mainly working in the fishing industry. So this is interesting because it could be that they are willing to pay less because they don't want to protect these ecosystems so that they can go and keep fishing there. However, this has kind of a negative play because these ecosystems are providing nursery and feeding grounds for this fisheries. So if these places are not protected, it could be that we might see a decline in the fish population because they're the ecosystems that they need for reproduction and feeding are not being protected. We also saw a higher willingness to pay with more knowledge, so more educated people, and among those more prone to conservation actions. And I'm going to explain what that means a little later. But how does that compare to other studies? So here I summarized some economic valuation studies that are published, and you can find them online, comparing different deep sea ecosystems. So all of these studies were with deep sea ecosystems that you're seeing down here, except for these two that were terrestrial. And there's a few things to notice here. First, I think that it's very clear that economic valuation studies with marine ecosystems at least have been focused on Europe and one here in Canada. So there's this huge knowledge gap in understanding people's connection and willingness to pay for ecosystems in the southern hemisphere. The other thing to notice is the values themselves. So we see that, so this is our study here, $8 to $23 for methane seeps in Costa Rica. And you can see that the number itself, it's quite similar to the other ones, it's within the same range, except for some of them here that are willing to pay a little bit more than Costa Ricans. We also see and notice that Costa Rican, so this terrestrial study here was also in Costa Rica, and we see that people are willing to pay quite more to protect methane seeps, so deep sea ecosystems compared to terrestrial ecosystems, which is pretty interesting to see if you consider that sometimes people feel disconnected to the deep sea and more connected to forests, for example, because you're actively seeing the forest. So it's easier to feel that deeper connection to something that you're always seeing. But what's interesting to look at also with this data is that willingness to pay as a percent of average income. And when we do this, when we calculate this as percent of average income, we see that Costa Ricans are actually willing to pay a lot more than the other parts of the world based on their average income. So really showing us what I was telling you about earlier, that Costa Ricans really value their biodiversity and they're willing to pay a lot of their own income to protect these ecosystems compared to, developed countries that are willing to pay less and also have a higher income. So if you also look at the values of income itself, you're going to see that even though people are getting more money, they're still willing to pay less than Costa Ricans. I also just want to mention that this study was the first one that was done with methane seeps, with chemosynthetic ecosystems, and with a marine ecosystem in Costa Rica and probably in America Latina. So just again, showcasing and showing you all that there is still a lot that we don't know about people's connection to marine ecosystems and chemosynthetic ecosystems, even though they are of huge importance to the health of the ocean. After the choice cards, we asked them for their level of agreement on conservation actions. So with this questions here, we wanted to see why people are willing or are not willing to pay for deep sea conservation. And I want to focus on these bottom statements here. Deep sea ecosystems should be protected so that I can personally have the option to use them in the future. They should be protected for the benefit of my children. They should be protected because they represent a unique and fragile ecosystem which has a right to exist. I think that with the choice cards and the willingness to pay value and the questions before the choice cards, we saw that people care about the biodiversity. And I think that the level of agreement on these statements really show us that people care and value the deep sea for the existence value, for the biodiversity value. We did the same thing that we did with the knowledge questions. We created this point-based system where when people totally agree with this, they got 1 point, totally disagree, 0 points, and we summed that so we could get a conservation index. So the higher that value, that means that people are more prone to conservation actions. And we did that so we could look at whether social demographic variables are also influencing people's perceptions about the deep sea. And the first thing that I want to show you about this is here I have this graph with knowledge on the x-axis and level of agreement on conservation, so the conservation index on the y-axis. And we see that with more knowledge, people tend to be more prone and more favorable to these conservation efforts. The other interesting thing that we saw with the social demographic variables was with that first question. So, what are the first things that you think about when you hear the words deep sea? And I analyzed all of those categories by each social demographic variable, and I'm showing you two of them here that I think are super interesting. So, here I'm showing you how many people mentioned emotions or environmental characteristics based on education level. And we see that the higher education level, the more people talked about the environment. So this blue line here, showing that people with more knowledge tend to think more about the deep sea as cold, dark, or those physical characteristics that we use to describe the deep sea. With lower education level, we see that people tend to talk more about the emotions that they attach to the deep sea. So this green line here. So this, I thought it was a very interesting and kind of opposite, oh my God, I forgot the word, an opposite interaction between education level and mentioning of these different perceptions. But how can you use all of these results, all of this data for deep sea conservation? And there's 3 points that I want to make here. So first, I'm going to talk to you about the application of these studies into conservation and management efforts, tools for identifying ecosystems in need of protection, and people's care about the deep sea. So first, I think that I might be preaching to the choir here again when I say that we can use willingness to pay studies in cost benefit analysis for protection, restoration, or damage assessment. We can also use willingness to pay studies to think about sources of income for those conservation efforts. So, for example, in Costa Rica, there was a study that showed that tourism might be a really great source of income. And tourists were willing to pay an airport tax for improved biodiversity conservation in Costa Rica. Likewise, we can think that Costa Ricans might also be willing to pay some kind of tax or some kind of fee to help in the conservation efforts. I also think that this type of study where we are trying to understand what English should be, but also connection of people to these ecosystems show us that the inclusion of local communities into management plans and efforts can help with the compliance exercise of these protected areas. Costa Rica has been historically engaging with local communities and all the different stakeholders into their management efforts. So these two are just two examples that are currently happening in Costa Rica. So marine areas for responsible fishing have this model for participatory management of small scale fisheries. And the Santa Rosa National Park follows this bottom-up approach with participation of the population at all stages of the placement of these national park. I also think that with the data and the results that we had, we can see that specific wordings and information about the knowledge held by people and by the local communities or different segments of the population can be really helpful in developing programs, but in effectively communicating with the public. So by knowing a little bit more about the people that you're talking to, you might be more effective into talking to them about this conservation and management efforts that you want to place into their local area. The second point that I want to make here is regarding tools for identifying ecosystems in need of protection. So we have 3 different tools that follow a criteria, and if the ecosystem has all of the fits these criteria, they are considered an ecosystem in need of protection. So these tools right now are vulnerable marine ecosystems or VMEs, ecologically or biologically significant areas or EBSAs, and particularly sensitive sea areas or PSSAs. These different tools have different types of criteria. So for the VMEs, an ecosystem to be considered a VME has to be unique, has to have a functional significance, has to be fragile, has to have the animals there have to have a life history traits that make the recovery of that ecosystem really difficult, and have to have a structural complexity. For EBSAs and PSSAs, you see that the criteria are a little different. But what I want to before that, actually, um, of deep sea ecosystems, hydrothermal vents are considered VMEs, and some have been described as EBSAs. Coral reefs, or I mean, not coral reefs, but deep sea corals are also considered VMEs. The sponge reefs in the deep ocean are also considered VMEs. However, methane seeps have not been yet officially recognized by these tools, but there are multiple studies showing the potential to fit their criteria. If you think back from last week's talk, I think I showed you that we do find unique animals and endemic animals at methane seeps. We see a functional significance of those ecosystems. I showed you that they're vulnerable and fragile with changes in the environmental conditions. There is a structural complexity, biological diversity, biological productivity. If we think about the chemosynthetic production, it is natural and it provides a lot of ecosystem services. So methane seeps have everything to be considered a ecosystem in need of protection. The other thing that I want to talk about these tools is that you see that only PSSAs include ecosystem services as a criteria. And they mention scientific, educational, social, cultural, and economic services provided by those ecosystems. But they're all very direct. They're all very resources that we can actually extract from these ecosystems. And none of these tools incorporate the non-use values. So the existence value, or I think the other word, and I'm sorry if I'm saying this wrong, bequest value of ecosystems are still not considered by any of these management tools. And we are seeing with our research that they are also extremely important into the connection that people feel to deep sea ecosystems. But does that connection and this willingness to pay mean that people care about the deep sea? I think that with the results from, the early questions in the survey, we see that people care about the deep sea, the biodiversity value. I mean, this is all that I've been talking about for the past, I don't know, 40 minutes, or I don't know how long it's been. But is willingness to pay the same as care? And I like to bring here the definition of care. So in the dictionary, we see that care is the provision of what is necessary for the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of someone or something. To feel concern or interest and attach importance to something. To look after and provide for the needs of. In the economics environmental philosophy literature, care has been described as environmental stewardship. So actions taken by people to protect, care, or responsibly use the environment. And I think that we are seeing that people are valuing the protection of the ecosystem. They are willing to pay for it, and they are attaching importance and connection to methane seeps and to the deep sea. So, what if is all of that if not care and environmental stewardship? But we are seeing that knowledge of the deep sea really influences people's perceptions and people connection to the deep ocean. And fear of the deep sea and lack of care may be attributed to lack of knowledge. So, the last point that I want to make here is that science communication and outreach efforts are just as important so that we increase the knowledge of the deep sea. Scientists in deep sea science have been increasingly more involved in science communication and outreach efforts. So, the Monterey Bay Aquarium actually has a deep sea exhibit where people can see deep sea animals with their own eyes. They even have a touch pool with giant isopods that people can touch live giant isopods. Scientists have been collaborating a lot with artists that they bring to sea, and then they have the exposition of their art or sculptures that they create while at sea. There are more involvement in podcasts. So there's these couple of deep sea scientists from Australia that started the Deep Sea podcast. And also another very cool thing that technology allowed us to do is to live stream dives of ROV, so remote operated vehicles on YouTube. So people can watch from the comfort of their house, scientists diving in the deep ocean, sampling and seeing all their animals. And not only watch, but also talk to the scientists. There are chat rooms where people can ask questions to the scientists, and they're there answering their questions live from sea. So this is also incredibly amazing. I personally started doing science communication during the pandemic on Instagram. So I have this Instagram page where um, I really just try to show deep sea, new things that we're finding with more research, but also old things and ideas that we're changing and the animals and why we shouldn't be really scared of the deep sea. And it has been just an amazing opportunity and an amazing thing for me to do because I really do feel like people feel more connected to the deep sea when they get the science and the information that we have about the deep sea. So, takeaways: Costa Ricans support the idea of protection of seeps. People seem to value the deep sea more for its existence value than for the physical resources. Social demographic variables affect people's perceptions about the deep sea and also willingness to pay for sea protection. And I want to say that, the goal of this research is not to implement a new tax or a new fee for Costa Ricans to pay. I think that the goal here and the idea is that we start looking and pay more attention to the existence value. So I think that policymakers and management efforts and management tools have to consider the existence value and social demographic variables and go beyond resource valuation so that these management and conservation efforts have a higher potential for success. And also the importance of science communication. I think that with more knowledge, people will be able to be a part of the policy, um, the input, they will be able to have a more science-based input into policy decisions and be more part of what is going on with their own backyard. Let's see if this video will play. So this video was actually the video that I showed in the survey. It is not playing, unfortunately. It's not playing. Well, the video is also available online if anyone's curious to see the video. It is, I think we published it as a supplementary file with the paper, so you can actually find this video if you're curious in watching it. So, yeah, with that, I just want to thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. That was very, very interesting. There's a couple questions in the chat. I know I have a couple questions, and I imagine some others do as well. If you could go, this one question refers to the slide, your map slide with
Yeah.
the willingness to pay percentages. So the
Mhm.
in the chat is, are the dollars shown for each of the other studies in the same year's dollars?
Yeah, so what I did there, I consider the conversion at the time that the study was done. So there were some studies from 2014, there were some studies from different years. So I consider the rate for that year, if that makes sense.
And the other question is, have you considered that many economists question the validity of willingness to pay studies because payments are hypothetical?
Yes, there's actually a whole section in the paper that we discuss the problems with DCE studies. I I didn't mention any here, but we do discuss that in the paper, and not only with the willingness to pay, but also with different things about DCEs. So, for example, one of the things that we talk about is whether if we had shown or not shown actually the footage for Methane Seeps, would people have a different willingness to pay? Because they saw all of these beautiful videos and beautiful animals in the deep sea. What if they didn't see any of that? Would maybe they have a lower willingness to pay? So yes, there is a whole section in the paper that we talk about problems that we might find with DCE and willingness to pay studies.
Alejandro has a few questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, John. My son is around. Would you mind to read it for me? I don't want to bother the
Oh, that's
Yeah,
fine.
attendance
I
of the
can read it.
conference. Thank
Sure,
you.
I'll read it so people can hear it. Thank you for your presentation, Olivia. Does the comparison between care and willingness to pay resemble the comparison between aesthetic and economic value? This is quite philosophical, but people can agree on the higher aesthetic value of a Picasso while being willing to pay only for a landscape drawing by a local artist. Does this distinction relate to your findings?
That is a really good question. And I'm not sure. This is people can agree on the higher aesthetic value while being only for a landscape drawing. Yeah, I think that comes I think we can think about it as if, people are willing to pay because the animals are pretty. or because that they know that the animal has a function in that ecosystem. So that is a good thing that I don't think I ever thought about that in that way, because for me it's like, I'm obsessed with Yeti crabs and I think they're beautiful, but I also know that they're important for the ecosystem. But that's the scientist talking. So I think it would be interesting to see, try to make that differentiation between aesthetic or actually value of that thing. I think it's also with biodiversity and landscapes. It is really hard with non-use values. It's really hard to put a value into non-use values. I think probably because of that too, because are people valuing just because it's pretty? Or are they valuing because there's something more to it? I think that also that is the case for the fishing attribute, the fisheries attribute that we have. One of the things that we discussed in the paper is whether people are willing to pay less for fisheries because they care less about the fish, or because they actually care a lot about the food on their plate, so they want to keep fishing. um so that is a very good point that I actually never thought about. So thank you for the question. I don't know if I answered it, but I think, it's a really interesting discussion for sure.
And then, David, did you want to ask your question, or would you like me just to read it?
Oh, I can just mention it. Have you had any interaction with the UN Seabed Authority since there? I mean, this deep sea is so important for 52% of the Earth, not including, the shallow seabed. But and they're setting a lot of rules at their Jamaica headquarters. So have you had any discussion or with them? I think methane seeps would be a little outside their consideration so
Yeah,
far.
that is a great question. I thank you for that question. I haven't personally, my advisor is actually quite involved into policy and actual management efforts. She's part of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. I don't know if you've heard of it, but DOSI is very involved in the discussions. They always send people to the meetings that happen at ISA, so the International Seabed Authority. They're very involved in it. Um, we did have this idea of trying to write some policy brief with Dozy, so that that could be more of a easier access for people when they go to these meetings. I haven't personally. I think, like you said, methane seeps are not really on directly on the radar right now, considering deep sea mining. But the other interesting thing about that is that there's no economic valuation study on deep sea mining, on any of the minerals that are being targeted for exploration. And I think that that would be really interesting and really great if we could do that, so that we can bring that into the table. I think when I started thinking about this project, it was because I wanted to be a part of the discussion. And I think that to be a part of the discussion at that level, bringing monetary values, you just get a seat on the table kind of thing. So I think that that would be really valuable for those discussions at the ISA.
I really encourage you to go to the ISA. I totally
Yeah.
encourage. And I actually did do a study on ecosystem services and deep sea mining
Oh, you
some
did?
time ago. I did, and I think it's a very, very complicated area. So if you think about where we're getting minerals, it's very hard.
Yes.
I won't go into it here, but it's something that really needs a lot of people's effort. And since it's such a big part of the Earth's crust, and so few people are working on it, I would certainly encourage you to put more time into it. And if you're interested, I can share some stuff that we've done before.
Yes, I would love to. I was gonna ask, can you share me your study?
Sure.
I was it with willingness to pay, or was it just, the economic value of the mineral itself?
It was looking at this, so it's a controversial issue for sure. Proposal and Bremen and Scripps and Woods Hole were all involved.
Okay.
And was on a mining project down by Papua New Guinea. And so one of the challenges, I think, is getting the science right. So, for example, there are about maybe 30 or 40,000 um, vents in that area. They have very similar species and such, and they had a proposal to mine not an active vent, but on the site of one. And there you're talking about, 20% copper. So it's an area of 11 hectares would displace a mine on the east side of the Andes that would be maybe 3,000 hectares. And so it's really challenging because we don't want to destroy biodiversity, etc. On the other hand, um, it's quite a difficult choice when you take a look at the concentration of minerals in some of the areas that could be mined. So there's no easy, from my perspective, we need to take kind of a global look at mining and say, so this study looked at where do you use the least water, do the least damage to biodiversity, have the least impact to the landscape, et cetera, and CO2 emissions and all that. So
Okay.
anyway, yeah.
Interesting. I will see if I can find
Yeah.
it. I'm
Yeah, if
interested.
I've got your email, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
I actually have a few questions. The piece where you were talking about the marine workers' willingness to pay, how many MPAs are around Costa Rica? And I would think maybe that had some sort of relationship, uh, because maybe they're thinking, oh, now there's going to be another one. It's going to impact our ability to work.
Yeah, so the there is this huge marine protection area that includes the Isla del Coco, and they just increased in 11 square kilometers, I think, the area, like in the last couple of years. So there's this huge area that just got even further more protected. And it is actually an area where there's a lot of fishing because it is a seamount. And in seamounts in the ocean, there's a lot of production, photosynthetic production, so it attracts a lot of fish. So it is actually a really important area for fishing. And then, we got protected. So it could be that. It could be that when we were running our survey, um, they were either already increased the area or they were about to increase the area. So it could have been that we also got some pushback um, from fishing or fishermen because of that. Because, they're thinking, well, where am I going to fish then? And I think it's what I mentioned that, sometimes you can see it both ways. You can see it, well, if I protect it, I won't be able to fish there. But if I don't protect it, are the fish gonna survive? Is the fish stock gonna survive because they won't have places to safely reproduce or safely feed? So it's also fisheries, it's also a very interesting and complicated aspect for that reason. Yeah.
And then I don't remember all your questions, but Costa Ricans' willingness to pay at a higher rate. Um, did you ask a question about like the culture or connection to the environment? Because I think I don't know Costa Rica particularly well, but the little I do know, they're very well connected to the environment. And I would think that may have a relationship there.
Do you mean just like straight up ask, how do
I'm
you
not
feel
sure
about
how
your
you would ask,
environment?
but yeah, I'm like, uh, maybe, yeah, something along those lines. I'm trying to think of an example of a question. I can't think of anything right offhand.
Yeah, we didn't ask that straight away, just like how connected do you feel to the ecosystem or to the diversity. But I think that with the questions that we had, we kind of got that answer a little bit indirectly. But I think it would be interesting to ask that, and see what they think. I know from conversations with my Costa Rican friends and collaborators that, they do really care and value their biodiversity. So I know that they have that personal connection. Um, but I think it would be interesting if we just ask, how do you feel about it? You know?
Corinne, go ahead.
Thanks. I just got back from a long trip, so this may be just not being awake. But it seemed like your indexes that you developed were very heavily biased towards positive numbers. And since you said that you had kind of a bias in your sample design, do you think that was a result of that?
I
You may
don't
have
think
had a
s
lot of young, enthusiastic, environmentally minded
Oh,
people
I
or something
see where
like
you're
that.
saying. I see where you're
Yeah,
saying. If the bias in the sample also created some kind of bias in the knowledge
right.
or the conservation, that's
Or
a
the
really
attitude, or
good
the attitude.
point. Yeah, I wish we thought of that. Because, just the same way that we did with the choice cards, that we created weights to the sample, we could have also created weights to those responses and see how that would influence. So that is a good point that we didn't think of, and I wish we had. Thank you.
And
Of course.
one more question. It might be dopey considering my knowledge of deep sea methane seeps consists of last week's lecture. But the so this is related to the blue economy, right? And one of the issues I think that maybe doesn't get enough attention, or I just don't know, is the particulate matter from the shipping industry in particular and the impact on climate change. And I guess I'm thinking about the oxygen minimization zone.
Mhm.
So is there a, I think the answer is yes, but is there impact there on the oxygen minimization zone, and how does that, just impact the whole system? Like I said, it's a dopey question, but
But wait, can you repeat that? Is it like impact from what
from the
in there?
particular matter from the shipping industry. So a lot of the boats use diesel. It emits these particulate matter that has an impact on climate change, obviously, and you know efforts maybe to minimize that would go a long way. I don't, like I said, it's a kind of a dopey question, but
I don't know if there is some direct effect. Obviously there is the indirect effect of just thinking about how, burning fossil fuels for either ship or cars or airplanes are increasing to climate change and, global warming. So that is how, global warming is also one of the reasons why ocean is losing oxygen, because we have the warming. Um, so I can think of that indirect effect. I don't know if there is like a direct effect in the ocean itself because of vessels. And yeah, I don't know.
it wasn't the greatest question. So,
It's okay.
are there any other comments or questions? Not seeing anything. Alejandro made a comment. Economist Ludwig von Mises can shed light on the philosophical aspect of valuation. However, you need to be cautious because his insightful views on economic evaluation were often intertwined with irrational commitment to free markets. Separating his valuable insights from his ideology can be challenging. So, so Olivia, would you like any last comments or to say anything further?
About what Alejandro said, or
Anything.
just in general?
Just closing remarks.
About what he said, I will say that I do remember a lot Mark, the economist that helped me, Mark Jacobson, talking a lot about free markets in his class. So there's a lot that I don't remember about it. No, I'm just really, really excited that, I had this opportunity. This was actually the first time that I had a lot of time to talk about this research. The previous experience that I had presenting this research, this economic valuation study, I only had 10 to 12 minutes. So there was a lot that I didn't talk about, and I always wanted to talk more about it because I'm honestly just really proud of it. And I think it was just a really awesome experience that I had. And also just thank you for, it's just also like this is the first time that I actually talked to economists about it. Either not just, Mark and Richard, but other economists that were not involved in the research. I only presented this to deep sea scientists and to the Scripps community. So this was a really great opportunity for me, and I thank you so much for your comments, your thoughts, your questions, and just being here. So thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, this was great, and I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did. There's been a lot of great feedback on the seminars and how excellent you did, and you should really be proud of what your work has done. And we look forward to seeing much more from you. So,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much. And before I let everybody go, I just want to remind everybody that next week is another seminar that we have. It's by Klaus Hubacek. We have a time change. It's usually at noon. This one is at 10 a.m. It's a global value change perspective on a just energy transition. Klaus is at the University of Groningen, and so hopefully you'll come back for those. But without anything else, oh, Sophie put something. Could you circulate any report or paper you may have of your work so that people can find it?
Maybe I can send you the paper, John, and you can share with everyone.
Sure, we can distribute that to everybody for sure.
Okay, awesome.
Well, then thank you again, and please, let us keep us up to date on your work.
Yeah, thank you.